This is a rather truncated session, and first we have to thank business for truncating it because they're not going to be present. So they're giving us some time, which is a very precious commodity, the value of which they don't realize. But I don't think that we're going to share that with them. Secondly, Alan has agreed that given his presentation yesterday, he's not going to add anything new to this session. So we have 3 speakers for this session. Elena is going to speak first, Shane will follow, and then Gabrielle, you heard this morning, is going to speak third. We want to ask the speakers to confine their inputs to about 10 minutes each, and then we have a very succinct session of 30 minutes of answers and questions. I think that it would be remiss of me not to thank the FES for supporting this initiative. For many of you who don't know, and for many of you who are far too young, the FES has been engaged in South Africa both directly and indirectly for over 35 years. And they've supported the initiatives that the trade union movement has had in this country. And especially for Gabrielle to take back to her union as well as to the DGB, the fact that the union movement is still alive and well in South Africa. And for all of you who think that we're climbing a huge mountain and we won't overcome this problem, I just want to share a very quick story with you. Between 1979 and about 85, we in the country struggled for the acceptance of sanctions by the European Union, as well as by the AFL-CIO, the British TUC, and so on. And they were all very much convinced that sanctions would not work in South Africa. And then in June, July 85, many of us were detained, and following that, the DGB, together with the TUC and others, came to South Africa. They met with Bishop Tutu on the Sunday morning at the Holiday Inn in town, and the good bishop, in his sort of way, suggested that they go and visit Alexander Township. So we drove them out to Alexander Township, and the then South African Defence Force, which had blockaded Alexander Township as part of the boycott process, then surrounded that delegation and kept them captive for about 3 hours. To a person, that delegation was then convinced that they should have sanctions in South Africa. So I want to send out a message to Neil and everybody else who have struggled so hard about the minimum wage that we can't despair, that some moment in time this matter will change, and it will not be due to our own action, but it will be due to the action of others, and we will overcome. So with that, I want to ask Elena to do her presentation. Thank you.
So in my presentation, I'll try to answer a question of how can we ensure maximum participation in the national minimum wage. And I propose 2 ways of looking at it. First, we can look at who is covered and who is not covered, and that part will be dealt in exemptions and exclusions. The second way of looking at it is, can we incentivize business so that it will comply with the legislation willingly and hence ensure maximum participation of business in the national minimum wage? So I'll start with exclusions and exceptions. And I think that the best way of describing them is a means of, at first, limiting the coverage and the extent of the national minimum wage, but at the same time providing certain flexibility and accommodating various labor-related, business-specific or country-specific needs and circumstances. There is a certain level of legislative difference between exclusions and exemptions, and for the purposes of timekeeping, I would rather not dwell into them. What I really want to emphasize is that according to the ILO research, the majority of countries, namely 61% of the countries that have national minimum wage, do not allow any exclusions. They may allow for some exemptions, but everybody must be covered. ILO also encourages all countries that have national minimum wage to have the maximum possible coverage. But it also understands that in order to have a decent wage floor, and in cases of wage and productivity differences, one may not have one single level of wage that will be sufficient for everyone. Hence, one can create tiers. So essentially, a tiered approach is a good alternative to excluding certain sectors and keeping the national minimum wage at a decent level. Numerous countries have numerous exclusions. Some exclude film production makers, some exclude mariners, and there's different kinds of them. However, if we aggregate all exclusions possible, we'll see that most countries have to answer the following questions. What do we do with the low-wage sector? Do we accommodate youth and workers with disabilities and workers in learning programs? Do we include public service employees or do we exclude them? What do we do with businesses? Do we allow small and medium-sized enterprises to be excluded, or do we maintain that they should stick to the national minimum wage? So I'll try to give a very brief overview of how this works in different countries. On the low-wage sector, it's usually comprised of domestic workers and agricultural sectors, and excluding a low-wage sector is an extremely bad economic policy, precisely because the whole purpose of a national minimum wage is to fight poverty and inequality. And there is no way on earth you can fight poverty and inequality when excluding the poorest of the poor from the national minimum wage coverage. So numerous countries, rather than excluding the low-wage sector, include it at a lower tier. And commonly, that's around 60 to 90% of a general minimum wage. Some countries moved even further and tried to phase out those exemptions completely, like Chile. In 2008, it set a target that domestic workers should receive 100% of a national minimum wage, rather than the 75% that they were owed in 2009. And by 2011, they actually succeeded, and more countries are following suit. When it comes to youth and workers with disability, the problem is that even though there are numerous examples in the international experience of providing a lower tier for youth, and that's commonly set at 60 to 90%, the whole purpose of excluding youth and workers with disabilities is based on an unproven assumption that these categories of workers have less productivity, or have less skills, or require more on-the-job training. However, in principle, excluding youth and or workers with disabilities is a sort of discrimination because it violates the principle of equal wage for equal work. And more countries are recognizing it and are trying to improve those wages for the youth and workers. Workers in learning programs are also unfortunately very commonly excluded, or put at a lower tier that is normally around 50 to 90% of a general national minimum wage. What we want to emphasize is that more and more countries, however, move to include workers in learning programs and increase the proportion of their wages according to the year of the employment. The example you see is Pakistan and El Salvador, where they pay 50% of the national minimum wage to the apprentices in the first year, and 75% in the second year, and 100% in the third. I just want to point out that of the countries that have recently instituted a national minimum wage, and Malaysia is a great example. Malaysia actually considered a question: should we include youth, workers with disabilities, and learners, or should we exclude them? And Malaysia came to consensus that excluding or putting them at a lower tier will be discriminatory. So Malaysia said that the national minimum wage is applicable to everyone, regardless of your age or disability or learning program. Moving on to business exclusions. This is a very hotly debated topic. Let me start first with family businesses. Across the world, there is a certain move to allow family businesses that employ family members only to be excluded from the national minimum wage paying. The examples are many, Lebanon, UK, Korea, and Spain among the most countries. This is one of the business exclusions that is very rarely debated because pretty much everybody understands why is it in place. A very debated topic, however, is what should we do with small and medium-sized enterprises? I should say up front that the number of cases where small and medium-sized enterprises have been excluded or have been allowed not to pay national minimum wage are extremely rare. It's mainly US, Nigeria, Morocco, and Nepal. And there are several reasons for that, and there is several research done on that topic. And it deals with the fact that when small and medium enterprises are excluded, they get a certain incentive to remain small. So they do not, they grow very reluctantly, and they do not use the economies of scale. Hence, they become less and less competitive over time. So excluding them from national minimum wage coverage, meaning allowing small businesses not to pay a national minimum wage to its employees, actually will be hurting businesses themselves, not only the workers who will not be covered. Second problem with that is, again, there's been numerous research showing that when small and medium-sized companies are allowed not to pay national minimum wage, it may lead to certain violations of legislation. When companies do illegal accounting schemes to show that they still are entitled to the incentive, or when companies start employing full-time employees as volunteers or put them on a zero-hour contracts and various different stuff. Hence, the conclusion from the research we've done is that excluding small and medium-sized enterprises is a very risky practice. There is, however, an alternative, and an alternative to excluding them is allowing employers to apply on a case-by-case basis and to prove that this particular employer indeed cannot afford paying a national minimum wage. That is what we call an exemption. This practice is utilized in many countries, namely Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Portugal. And it can be a very successful tool in giving business some sort of flexibility and in accommodating business needs at the same time by ensuring the maximum participation. When we're allowing for exemptions, though, we have to set a very clear criteria for exemptions, a time period, and the fallback line below which companies really cannot pay their workers. I want to mention very briefly that currently South Africa is using an exemption system in its bargaining councils and sectoral terminations agreements, so this practice is very well maybe scaled up. So, very briefly, key points on exemptions and exclusions. Minimum wage should have maximum coverage. That's the bottom line. Excluding whole sectors or whole categories of workers is a very risky practice that limits national minimum wage effectiveness and eventually does not lead to any good. To the contrary, rather than excluding sectors, one can provide tiers, normally set at 70 to 90% of a general minimum wage, and tiers that can be lately phased out over a certain period of time, or can build in exemption systems for businesses in case they're unable. Now, really very briefly on incentives, I know. Incentive is another way of ensuring maximum participation, but then targeting businesses to allow them to comply with the legislation. There are 5 types. Public awareness campaigns, which include billboards, ads, and various means of public communication that paying a national minimum wage is good, both for business and for the workers. We think it can work because companies face high reputational costs. They don't want to appear on the name and fame and shame list. And again, public awareness raises awareness not only among employers, it raises awareness among workers, and workers can later champion their rights at the working place. Very briefly on certificate of compliance, another very successful scheme that is currently run in the South African clothing and textile industry. Employers apply for a certificate. They undergo labor inspection. If they're found to be compliant, they're issued a certificate which later gives them access to public tenders, various government incentives, probably IDC loans or whatever else we can find. Public procurement is a very important way of ensuring compliance, and that includes making sure that in every company that participates in a public tender must comply with the national minimum wage. And not only the contractor, but also its subcontractors must be liable for paying a national minimum wage. A good way, why is it a good way of ensuring compliance and incentivizing business? Because it sort of triggers compliance multiplier. It can reach companies that are both small and large. It reaches not only the main contractors, but subcontractors. And I think that's the best part. Tax incentive is one of the mostly asked business incentives. However, this is the one that needs to be approached with most caution. There are several successful international experiences of providing tax incentives, namely in Thailand, Malaysia, Brazil, and France. However, any tax incentive can put a strain on fiscus. Finally, government financial assistance. The purpose of this incentive is to tie subsidized loans, government grants, with national minimum wage compliance, i.e., any company that wants to apply for an RDC loan for a government-run incentive scheme should be compliant with the national minimum wage legislation. I know I have 1 minute left, so my question was, how can we ensure maximum participation? And I think that can be done via these 5 steps. First, we should have the maximum possible coverage, which means including every worker. Secondly, if we can't include every worker and give them a decent wage salary, we can create a lower tier for them and accommodate them in this way. We should provide for exemptions so that businesses will get some sort of flexibility, but we should very much limit them. It is very useful to provide incentives to businesses because they can be a good tool of ensuring compliance and ensuring participation. But all those incentives should come with strict enforcement and monitoring. And on this note, I would like to thank you very much.